There are refugee camps in Serbia, more in the south than in the north. Some of them people can seek shelter there, but the Serbians don't want to consider this to be a permanent phenomenon. So, like many other governments around Europe, they will hope that it goes away, but it won't.
And that was correspondent Andrew Connolly reporting live from the Serbian border town of Burgos. It's exactly 10 minutes past the hour. The United Nations Refugee Agency says it is deeply disappointed by European member states for failing to agree on a plan to relocate thousands of asylum seekers. On Monday, EU interior ministers were unable to reach consensus on how to accommodate 120,000 people, prompting the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to call for solidarity from EU member states. Now, rights groups have expressed concern on discriminatory practices as EU member states deal with the migration flows and are calling on European leaders to respect human rights. Juliana Wahlgren is in charge of migration and discrimination issues at the European Network Against Racism. She told RFI's Mike Woods that her group underlines 3 issues when analysing discrimination when it comes to migration. Sorry, we are not able to get that report from Mike Woods, but we'll now move over here to France. We'll try, of course, to bring you that report a little later in the program. Now over here to France, and France is to launch airstrikes against the Islamic State armed group in Syria. On Monday, President François Hollande said airstrikes would be necessary in Syria ahead of a debate in Parliament this Tuesday. Now, RFI's Tony Cross is here to tell us more. Tony.
Yes, Hollande said that strikes will be necessary in Syria. France has been flying reconnaissance flights over Syria for the last week, and he said that they proved the necessity of that. That's a reversal of the previous decision, which was only that French aircraft would only operate over Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Now, how certain is this after last week's decision, not to strike targets in Syria?
Last week it was a bit ambiguous. It was, we'll have surveillance or reconnaissance flights, and it was left a little open. It was pretty much understood that airstrikes would follow, but it wasn't specifically stated. Now it's a little less ambiguous, but we're talking François Hollande there. He still hasn't said we are going to have airstrikes on Syria. He said they're necessary, but I think we can take it that means that they will take place. And Defense Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian certainly seems to think so. He says that Syria is now IS's main base and that it's been a blind spot for French strategy, and now it's got to stop being that.
Now, let's actually have a look at the debate taking place today. How important is this, and how much difference is there across the floor here within the parties?
Yes, there's a debate going on now in Parliament, but it's not a debate which will result in a vote. It's the President's decision. It's a consultative debate. He has the obligation to talk to Parliament, to allow Parliament to discuss it, but he can't veto this move. But anyway, it probably wouldn't have, because the right wing, the mainstream right party, now called Les Républicains, used to be the UMP, most of its members agree that there should be airstrikes, and they also agree with the government or with the Socialist Party that there shouldn't be any land operations against Syria. That's the majority in both parties don't want to see that. So there isn't a lot of dispute over that. There are small groups of dissident MPs in both parties, as a matter of fact, and in all parties, who believe that it's now time to cozy up to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, that he's the lesser of 2 evils, and that they should work with him against IS.
My thanks there to RFI's Tony Cross. Now we're going to go back to that report from RFI's Mike Woods. Just to recap, that the United Nations Refugee Agency has said that it is deeply disappointed that European member states have failed to agree on a plan to relocate thousands of asylum seekers. He spoke to Juliana Wahlgren, who's in charge of migration and discrimination issues at the European Network Against Racism, and she said that her group underlines 3 issues when analysing discrimination when it comes to migrants.
When negotiating relocation and resettlement plans, some member states have announced and declared already that they prefer to select some migrants according to their ethnicity or religious background. The second concern is ethnic profiling, especially when now, due to the migration flows, there are more stop-and-search practice being conducted by the police and national authorities. We are afraid that these stop-and-search measures will only not discriminate the people coming to Europe, but also on communities perceived as migrants, like the Roma community or the Muslim community. The third point would be anti-migrant sentiment. Since the beginning of the crisis, there is an increase of hate speech coming not only from national authorities, but also from high-level politicians. And we are afraid that if perpetuated, this kind of practice will lead to violence against migrants.
Where are discriminatory speech and practices most present today?
It's across EU. It's an overall tendency, but what we see is that there are countries that are recording and reporting more incidents of violence against migrants, and especially hate speech as well from politicians. What we could name is there are many violence on the borders. In Hungary, for example, there is an increase of hate speech against migrants in the UK. In Germany, there is an increase of houses who were burned since the beginning of the year. More than 78 houses were burned since January 2015. However, you see different acts of discrimination targeting migrants. People, when stopped and searched, they report more and more violence from the police in some member states. When in Hungary and in the Czech Republic, many trains were stopped by the authorities before they could cross the border. In that case, many people that looked like migrants were the only ones stopped and searched. So what you can see is that different practices are being applied, but nevertheless, they represent a form of discrimination.
How do you interpret what we've been seeing in some of the eastern countries, not just in Hungary, where the state of emergency has been declared, but even Germany, Austria, where border controls have been reinstalled? Are these purely for controlling the flow of migration, or is there more to it as well?
What we see is a domino effect. Many countries will reproduce these border controls until a concrete solution is negotiated by member states at the European level. It's going to be a practice that will be multiplied in the next months. Of course, the argument is the protection of the borders, or to have a better control of the migration flow. What is our concern is that these practices will lead to ethnic profiling. So just people that look like migrants or who are perceived as migrants will be stopped and searched and be controlled. What we call is that member states do not apply stop and search practice and do not apply violence. For us, it's an argument that they use for political purpose and for the management of their migration agenda, but the reality is really that people will suffer more and more discrimination when trespassing intra-borders or in the secular movement in the European Union.
And that was Juliana Wahlgren from the European Network Against Racism speaking to us from Brussels. And now for a look at